Excellent. Everybody's starting to introduce themselves. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon if you're in UK and Europe, or good morning if you're joining us from across the pond. We shall start in a minute, but please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Also, whilst we are settling in, as you know, Albert is present on all social media platforms. So if you haven't joined us yet, please feel free to join us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, everywhere, so that you can stay up to date with all the news and all the events that we are running. We'll give everyone another minute and then we'll start. Excellent. Nice to see everybody's name popping up. All right, let's wait another minute while we have everybody joining in. Right, I think number is stabilizing. I think we are ready to go. Good afternoon again, and hello to everyone, and welcome to this Planet Placement event run by BAFTA Albert Consortium. This evening, we're going to be focusing on writers and how do we engage audiences on the topic of climate change and sustainability. We ran a number of events in the past around the editorial aspect of the work for the industry. The last one was towards the end of last year, where we spoke to commissioning editors. This is a continuation of this conversation across the industry. We're going to be focusing more on the scripted side of things around, you know, how can you write the planet into our content. We have a wonderful panel joining us. We'll have presentations from Laura from Futera and Nikki Hawkins from On-Run Media. We're going to be presenting us with some thoughts around how to best engage the audience on this broad topic and some tips about how to best achieve that. And we'll be joined in a conversation by Olivia and Javid, both writers. For more in-depth conversations around how can we possibly achieve that in a way that feels authentic, relevant, impactful, and creative. Because that's the name of our game. As we always do, thank you very much to our partners as they enable us to run these events. The BAFTA Albert partners, Location One, Kama, Good Energy, Green Tomato Cars, and Sargent Disc, which is obviously very sort of topical today as they run the final draft software. So thank you very much for our sponsors. You can find out more about everything that they do in the chat function. My name is Jeremy Mathieu. I'm a sort of trainer and advisor for the broadcasting industry on climate change and sustainability. I work mostly with broadcasters and commissioning editors to educate them on the topic of climate change and to explore creative ideas about how do we engage the audience on the topic. I work with all genres, and it's really interesting to see how the conversation has been evolving over the last few years on the scripted side of things, both comedy and drama, to moving from why should we talk about this to how do we talk about this. And the conversation is becoming much more interesting, I think, both at a corporate level for broadcasters, really trying to figure out, understanding the editorial importance of what they do, but also at a more creative level with commissioning editors, producers, really wondering, okay, I really want to do something about this, but how do I do it? How do I do it in a way that's authentic, relevant, meaningful for my audience, and not preachy, but also that has an impact that, generally move the situation forward in terms of becoming more sustainable. The conversation is really picking up, so it's why it's so interesting to be running this event right now. As I mentioned, my background is all about sustainability. I was a producer before, but I've moved, in terms of into a sustainability role to try to support the industry. I always start every presentation with a little bit of background around what is science telling us. What do we know from the science? How do we make sure that we all speak in the same language in terms of what the goalposts are? And from experience, the more we can understand how our audiences are impacted by climate change and the transition to a sustainable society, because I think we need to start learning to speak about those two things in parallel. The more we can understand how audiences' lives are impacted, the easier it is to come up with a more creative conversation around how do we then sort of represent that, reflect that, and support our audiences. So without further ado, I'll do a short introduction around that, presenting a bit of different types of framings, and then we'll move on to our speakers. We're going to be sort of presenting us some more sort of reflections on how to to bring that into your work. So we'll come back to our speakers in a moment, but I will share my screen for just a minute to present you some insights. So first thing to do, I think, is always to come back to the science and always come back to, what are the goalposts of success? What does success look like in terms of addressing climate change? And I always start with this number, 1.5 degrees Celsius. You may be familiar with it. You may have just come across it recently. You may be unclear as to what it means. Just want to clarify what it's all about. Climate scientists have worked at what the average temperature was across the whole planet before the Industrial Revolution, so about the 1850s. Yeah, so we worked at the global average back then, and they worked out that if we increase that global average temperature by 1.5 degrees or more, we hit what they call dangerous or catastrophic climate change. So meaning the conditions around us in terms of the natural environment are not compatible with the kind of thriving, prosperous societies that we all take for granted. So that 1.5 degree target is becoming a policy target based on what we know from the science will happen if we go beyond that number. Now, it's really important to clarify what it all means, because it's not a case that 1.49 degree, everybody's happy and we're having a massive party and everything's fine, and suddenly 1.5, poof, the planet explodes. It doesn't work like that. We've already warmed by 1 degree compared to pre-industrial era, and we're already feeling a lot of impacts at that stage, and the impacts are going to continue to get worse as we go towards 1.5 degree and beyond. So it's really important to understand that there's a gradual change. And the amount of risk that we're experiencing if we go beyond that 1.5 degree becomes much harder for us to adapt to and function. Now, if you think about 1 degree, it doesn't mean much to us. If you think about the temperature outside or the temperature in your room maybe, but I think it's not really appropriate. A very useful way to think about that number. A much more useful way to think about it is to think about your body temperature. If your body temperature increases 1.5 degree, you're not doing really well. You get a bit of fever going on. If your body temperature increases more than that, you may struggle to function and keep going. That's what we're talking about here. How do we preserve the health of the natural environment so that we can function within that and our human society? And I think understanding it in this way, kind of reframes this whole number of 1.5 degree. And 1.5 is actually a big number in terms of the impact that it's having on the natural environment. So how do we keep the temperature to 1.5 degree? Well, it's going to take a lot of changes in our society. This is a bit of a, this is kind of the more sciencey graph I'll be showing you today. Don't worry, I'll talk you through it. This is a graph that the climate science community tells us, we need to reduce the impact that we're having on the climate and how quickly we need to do that. All the different lines represent the pathway telling us how quickly we need to reduce our emissions. So the byproduct of activities that add more of those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and how quickly we need to do that in order to have a 50% chance of staying under 1.5 degree. And as you can see, that horizontal line here is net zero. So we absorb as much as we emit from the atmosphere, so we have a net zero contribution to it. And that vertical line here is 2050. And our emissions have been increasing all the way up to 2019. What the graphs, what the scientists telling us, we need to start reducing our emissions right now, pretty dramatically. We need to have halved our global emissions within less than 10 years by 2030, and we need to get to net zero by 2050. That's the kind of pathway we need to be on across a whole planet, a whole human civilization, in terms of reducing our impact to have a 50% chance of staying under 1.5 degree. That's the scale of the challenge. We need to do that at a time where the impacts of climate change, we're feeling right now just going to continue to increase and get worse, make it harder for us to function and adapt. And a time where we may have, 1 or 2 extra billion people lifting themselves out of poverty and aiming to live in a middle-class, high-consumption type lifestyle that, we normalize basically. So that's the challenge. How do we transform our societies within this time frame, adapting to the impacts that are coming our way, and still have thriving, prosperous societies that, that we all aspire to? That's half the challenge, I should say, because what really struck me when I saw this graph for the first time when it was released in 2018 is that all the conversation is happening around net zero 2050. That's what everybody's focused on and banging on about, rightly so. It's a massive challenge. But at the moment, our plan A is reliant on everybody alive in the second half of the century to live in societies that absorb huge amount of carbon from the atmosphere at the same time as being, thriving, prosperous, and all this. If that net zero line here means that we absorb as much carbon as we emit every year, everything that's underneath means that we need to absorb more than we emit on a given year. Now, that's a huge challenge because we may have technologies by then, but we don't really know yet if we'll have them or not. But that's a huge amount of carbon that people in the future are going to have to absorb from the atmosphere. But that gets interesting as well for me because I'm not surprised we're seeing more and more young people, coming out in the streets or getting the voice heard saying that, guys, this is not fair. this is a question, it's not just a question of science or environment, it's a question of justice. It's a question of what kind of society do we want to be? What kind of responsibility do we want to have towards each other? And basically, young people are telling us, all of you guys, all the adults in the room are building up a massive debt, like a carbon debt, a bit like a credit card debt, thinking we don't need to worry about that debt because people in the future are going to pay that debt for us. That's basically what we're saying in a simplified manner. But that becomes more interesting for me because it shifts the conversation away from just science and environment towards very much the question of societies around how do we sort of have those relationships between different parts of societies and how do we share the responsibility for taking action. The good news in all this is that we know how to fix it. We have all the knowledge that we need, we have all the technology we need, we have all the cash, all the capital that we need to transition into a sustainable society. What's lacking is the drive, is the motivation, is the leadership to make it happen. Again, the climate science community in their report in 2018 about 1.5 degree are telling us that to stay under 1.5, what we need is rapid, far-reaching, unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. This is what's going to be required if we want to, be fit for a zero carbon world, if you want to think about it in this way. And that's interesting because that's scary for all of us. We don't really know what unprecedented changes mean. How do I do an unprecedented change, at the level of the whole society? So that's become more. It becomes less a question of specific behaviors or anything like that. It becomes more a question: how do we, as a culture, tackle this problem? How do we come together to try and to figure out what that path forward looks like? And it becomes less a question of taking individual responsibility towards more about how do we collectively define what we want to take as a path forward. And that is full of emotions. And when we start to talk about climate change, when you start to talk about the impacts we're feeling already, what that transition to a zero carbon society may mean for people, all kinds of emotions come up. I do a lot of training and all this kind of stuff comes up a lot in the training. People may feel angry because of the lack of action or because of the fact that they feel, challenged about what their lifestyle, is driving. People will feel overwhelmed. People will feel scared, anxious or guilty or sense of grief. And all of these emotions are part of the climate change conversation. It is not, for a long time, we've been focusing on a very fact-based, conversation around, these are the facts, you need to get people to achieve this and that. I think for me, this emotional dimension is becoming much more interesting and much more important in that whole field, because it's about how do we change, culture, how do we bring everyone along with us, and typically there's a bit of a journey going on there. It's quite sort of familiar to us in a kind of the storytelling department, but some people may not be able to engage with those difficult emotions. People may be stuck at different stages. So, this is too scary. This is challenging my identity. This is challenging my sense of who I am or what I consider my good life to be. So I'm just going to push climate change away and not engage with this. Some people may be more at the stage of, kind of bargaining, where it's like, well, I've done my bit for the planet. I've got my water bottle. I don't need to do anything else. Thank you very much. Somebody else can do, something else. Some people may be at another stage of feeling completely depressed and demoralized and unable to imagine what path forward could be. And then some people may have processed some of that grief and feel on the other side more equipped to deal with those actions and say, okay, let's roll up until you don't get to work. But it's important for us, as we're trying to reach the whole of the population through our content, to acknowledge that different people may be at different stages of that journey. And it's not just about hammering them with a single message, but it's more about welcoming them to that transition and figuring out what does it mean for different people? How do we find the manners, the principles, the language in order to bring them to the conversation, feel more comfortable going through that journey, maybe process some of these emotions. And I would suggest that as we get more familiar with this, the conversation becomes less about climate change or describing climate change as a scientific problem and all this ugly, impossible to face kind of complexity, and becomes more a conversation about how do we transition into a thriving, resilient, sustainable world? How do we shift the lens of the conversation towards, what does it look like for all of us to move towards a solution on this? How do we start to imagine, to envision what a sustainable future can look like, in which we have managed this massive transformation of the whole, the whole of our societies? How do we make that a positive outcome? we spend so much time describing the problem, we haven't really sort of developed a narrative, a story of what a sustainable future look like, and how do we bring everybody along the journey with us. And when you unpack that, it becomes much broader as a topic. It becomes less around describing action or behaviors, and more about unpacking some of those social and sort of big society issues like democracy, like power, like toxic masculinity, like colonialism and racism. We can unpack all this as part of that transition into a more sustainable society. And I think as storytellers, that becomes really interesting, because it becomes a much broader space that we can explore and play with in order to meet the audience where they are and bring them along on that journey. So there'll be plenty more to discuss tonight. But just a nod to a really interesting piece of research that the Albert team has been working on for the last couple of years. It's called Subtitles to Save the World. You can find that on the Albert website. I'm sure the team will put a link there. Looking at a year's worth of telly and analyzing the subtitles that we have, and the type of language that we use within our programs, and figuring out how much do we speak about climate change or some of the solutions that we know are required to move to a sustainable society. And in a nutshell, we don't really talk about it very much, and we tend to normalize the kind of unsustainable behaviors and unsustainable patterns in society much more than we do the kind of more sustainable solutions that are required for us. So it's a really interesting provocation for us as an industry to think about how can we bring those topics more seamlessly into the conversation? How can we stop normalizing unsustainable stuff? And how do we sort of help the emotional journey that the audience is already on, and how do we start to unlock some of those issues that we are facing? So that's just a little sort of starting point for us to launch the conversation. I'm now going to turn to Laura, who's going to talk us through the Planet Placements project and all the great stuff that's been happening and the resources available to you as a writing community. Over to you, Laura.
Hi, thank you so much, and it's lovely to be here with you all. I'm just going to share my screen. So before I kind of jump into the details about Planet Placement, I'll just really quickly introduce myself and where I'm from. So I work as a creative director at the change agency Futera. So we're headquartered in London, but with offices in New York, Stockholm, and Mexico City. And this is our mission: to make sustainability so desirable it becomes normal. And that's been our mission for the past 20 years. And you'll see that all of our work is really geared around this mission. So whether we're working, on advocacy campaigns with NGOs like the Rainforest Alliance or WWF or Fashion Revolution, or with, big businesses like Tommy Hilfiger or Google or Formula One, we're always trying to make sure that sustainable development in its broadest sense, in terms of kind of climate action or equity, is positioned in a way that, that people can really get excited about, that they can get motivated into action rather than just kind of painting a picture of the problems. We really do focus on what the solution is and what that better future looks like. And crucially, what we do is try to have those conversations beyond, the usual green bubble. So why Planet Placement? So we started working on this a couple of years ago with the Albert team, and I think this quote kind of gets a bit to the heart of why Planet Placement. So obviously Jeremy's talked you through the science of how climate change and what it means and what we need to do about it. But really, as David Attenborough so wonderfully said, climate change is now a communications challenge. But actually, I think I'd take that a step further and say that climate change is actually it's a challenge of culture, really. And by culture, what I mean is the ideas, the narratives, the attitudes, the behaviors that influence and dictate societal norms. So culture fundamentally underpins what's normal. It underpins what's relevant, what's acceptable, and also what's desirable. So as TV and film makers, you really have an incredible influence in shaping culture, and therefore an incredible opportunity to make climate action, climate justice, and sustainable behaviours resonant and relevant culturally. And we've seen that the TV and film industry have done this before. So thinking about, embedding positive behaviours and shifting mindsets. To give an example here, in the 80s and 90s, it was actually a behaviour change kind of specialist came together with the TV industry in the US in an attempt to reduce drink driving fatalities, which was a major problem in the 80s, early 90s. So what happened was the term designated driver made it into hundreds of primetime TV shows, and TV shows like Cheers, and that worked. So starting to embed that that behaviour of a designated driver actually reduced drink driving fatalities by nearly a third. So we know that TV and film can be really powerful. So the question is really, how do we then apply that power to the issue of climate and storytelling? Now, you would be forgiven for thinking that climate storytelling has been a bit of a minority pursuit and can often tend to look a bit like this. And that's really not what Planet Placement is asking you to do. It's not asking you to go and create this kind of work. This exists, but what Planet Placement is an ask really is a brief around how do you bring the climate into the content that you're writing already, or how do you create new, unexpected, surprising stories that go beyond this type of filmmaking. And there are two ways through Planet Placement that you can really think about doing this. So the first one is raise the issues, and the second is show the actions. So raise the issues is really about how an ask to create content around the major climate issues that we face and how these intersect with lots of other issues, like racism, colonialism, and justice. And then secondly, it's around showing the actions. How do we normalise the sustainable behaviours that everyone can take to make a positive impact on towards sustainable development? So raising the issues and then showing the actions, putting those actions like, we saw in the designated driver example onto screens and really normalizing that. So on the Planet Placement website, you'll find on lots of detail behind these. And you'll see here in Raise the Issues, there are around, I think there are 7 or 8 major environmental trends that are available to us. And these include really interesting insights, facts, and stories. And what we've done is we split them into brutal truths, which is really like the harsh reality. What's the harsh reality that we're facing? And then also beautiful possibilities. So what's the more hopeful, positive vision that we're seeing, evidence that we're heading towards and that we can actually do this. And I think really what's to say is that in these trends that you're going to find great ideas for storytelling. In here there's drama, there's conflict, there's interesting characters, heroes and villains. So how do we tell those stories? How do we tell them in a way that kind of speaks to our audiences? Not just as Jeremy was saying, it's not just about articulating the problem over and over again, but actually articulating the beautiful possibility of the future that we could have. And then on to showing the actions. So these are the mindsets, the behaviours and the actions that the public need to take in order to make, to kind of contribute to making a more sustainable future possible. So these actions, we base these on something called the Good Life Goals, which you can kind of find out a little bit more about on the website. So the Good Life Goals are everyday actions that people can take that can contribute to the UN's, that's United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And each of these, they're kind of themed around eating, travel, buying, resourcefulness, wasting less, and nature as well. And each of these themes kind of split out into various actions that we want to see people taking en masse. So these are the actions that we need to normalize. So I've just pulled out a couple here under eat better, you know, eating less meat, choosing sustainable seafood, cutting food waste. These are the things that we need people to be doing. So I guess the ask here is, how can you embed those behaviors in really, really natural ways into programming, into the content that you're creating in a way that suits the characters, or as a way to potentially extend the characterization as well. So to give you a little bit of inspiration of how this can work, we just put a couple of examples here, and there's many, many more on the Planet Placement website. So this is how, even when writers weren't writing about the climate, they managed to tell a climate story in a really, you know, seamless, natural way. So if if I May Destroy You in episode 7, the main character, Arabella, she's recruited as a presenter for this startup vegan business, who are looking to essentially reach more diverse audiences. And she's kind of employed as a bit of an influencer type. And there are a couple of really great scenes in here where she starts to realize that actually she's been used by this company. And, you know, she has dialogue with other characters about the links between colonialism and the environmental crisis that we're in today. And it actually culminates in her kind of filming an Instagram live for the company, and she kind of sabotages the whole thing over the hypocrisy of it all. And I think really what's interesting here is, for a piece of work whose really the main storyline was about consent and sexual violence, Michaela Cole, the writer, found a really compelling way to include an issue about environmental justice in it. And then the second example here on Big Little Lies, so one of the characters' daughters, there's a whole storyline about her in season 2, struggling to come to terms with the environmental crisis that we're all facing. So again, a really, Big Little Lies is not about the climate, or you wouldn't think, but it is. They've found a way to kind of bring that into content. So just some principles in terms of how you might think about doing this is really four things. So find the climate angle. So climate, I think sometimes often because the narrative is very scientific, but actually it's really personal. So climate affects everyone, some people in more disproportionately than others. There is a climate angle in every story. Show the solutions, not just the problems. So actually, can we paint a picture of a better, more sustainable future that people want to be a part of and want to run towards? Make it accessible and human. And then finally, I think that just goes back to Jeremy's point around the fact that people are coming at these issues from different places. So we really just have to have empathy for that. And then finally, to tell a great story. Most importantly of all, don't sacrifice what you are best at, which is storytelling, but it's about finding a way to tell that that makes sense. And then just finally, ask yourself, does it pass the planet test? So this is something that we created based on the Bechdel test in terms of what's the lowest common denominator, I guess, for if something passed the planet test. So we put it as this: it's 3 parts. 1, acknowledges that the natural world actually exists. 2, negative environmental behaviors are shown as negative character traits. And then finally, 1 person does something at least once to make the world a better place. So this kind of planet test is a really good place, I think, to start. And just finally from me, I think this is such a great opportunity. I think it is the best creative brief ever. As culture kind of creators and shapers, this is really an opportunity to shape society's response to climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. And all the resources that Laura mentioned are available on the website, wearealbert.org, and Planet Placement. I think it's available in the chat as well. Just before we move on to Nikki, I just want to say hello to Trisha, who is taking all your questions. So please do ask all the questions in the chat, in the Q&A, and Trisha will be gathering all of these, and we'll be turning to Trisha during the course of the evening to make sure we answer all your questions. So just wanted to say a quick hello. Before we do that, let's move to Nikki to hear about another presentation. Over to you, Nikki.
Hi everyone, it's so nice to be with you this evening. It's just wonderful to connect with people from all over the world, and thank you very much for making the time. I am going to share my screen as well, and I'm going to talk to you about the work that my organization does and is doing in this space, which is all, hang on. There we go. Which is all about how we can use storytelling to change the world. So some consistent themes. We are also about how do we change culture? How do we influence the stories that people hear, the things that it's normal for people to think. And we have a project that is focused on the climate story. We've got 6 principles about how we can tell the climate story to drive change, to shift public thinking, to change hearts and minds about climate change. I'm not going to have time for all 6 today, so we will send a link round with the full resources. I'm going to go through 3 of them today. And it's all premised on a lot of social science research that shows that stories matter. They matter to us at all kinds of levels, but we also think in story. And I probably don't need to tell you this as creatives, as people who specialize in stories. But there's some really interesting insights in terms of how we process the world using story. And this is my favorite quote from a recent meta-analysis of human cognition, which showed that humans cannot spend a moment of their waking life without making inferences. They can spend hours or even days without ever engaging in reasoning. So if we're trying to use communications and stories to change how people think, we need to understand those inferences. We need to understand the stories that we're thinking in so that we can navigate and tell a different story in order to shift our societal response to big challenging issues like climate change. And here in the UK, at least, we think in some fairly predictable stories when it comes to climate change. I'm not going to promise that this is also going to be the case wherever you are in the world, but hopefully you will see some familiar patterns that do resonate where you are. Firstly, we do know that there's a climate emergency. By and large, we recognise that climate change is happening and that it's a serious problem. But we think that other people are the problem. So they don't get it, they aren't acting, they aren't doing enough. So there's a real sense of kind of blaming others for inaction around climate change. We suspect that tackling climate change is not compatible with living our lives and having a functioning economy. So there's this sense of a trade-off between a good life and a kind of climate-friendly life. And because of all this and other things, we quickly and easily become fatalistic, and we assume that nothing can be done, and we tune out, and we've had enough and we can't quite cope with it, especially at the moment, given there's another big crisis facing the world. And these stories are continually being activated and reactivated by what we see and hear. So we also know that how we talk shapes perceptions, and the way that we frame issues. It's not just about whether we're talking about climate change, it's about the way that we talk about climate change. Lots and lots of research shows that the choices we make and how we say what we need to say can have huge effects in terms of how the message lands, what people understand, who they believe to be responsible. Do they think that this is a priority? So things like what we lead with, what we emphasize and how we explain something, and crucially what we don't say. These choices we make in how we tell stories and how we present information can lead to quite radical differences in how people think, feel and act. So what we've done with our project on climate change is we've kind of scooped up what we see as the most useful, applicable and reliable research in this space in order to shape these 6 principles for how we can shift hearts and minds in a really helpful direction when it comes to climate. And there'll obviously be some consistency with what you've heard from Jeremy and what you've heard from Laura, which is a good thing. Repetition is a good thing, because we need to tell a new story about climate change. We need to leave that story of fatalism, of disengagement, of powerlessness in the past if we're to be able to transition and transform our society. And we know that repetition really matters, and we need to keep retelling and reimagining the stories that allow us to move forward on this issue. So I always say repetition is a good thing, but you will hear some repeats from what we've already heard. So the first principle is to make it doable and to normalize action. We have heard a lot of apocalyptic stories. We have a sense of being overwhelmed. And as I said, we also kind of think that other people are the problem, which can lock us in some really unhelpful assumptions and ways of thinking about climate that just leave no scope for us to move out of the crisis. So we need to get beyond that. But all too often we get stuck in this space of normalizing inaction. And this is an example of how that can play out. So this is Ellie Goulding, who is a fantastic advocate for action on climate change. And she talks about how she gets a backlash. She gets an ugly backlash when she talks about climate change, and which she feels jeopardizes her career, and she talks about losing followers. And I understand exactly why she's doing this. She's saying, I'm talking about this issue because it matters, and I'm talking about it in spite of this reaction I get. And that's, you know, that's her truth, and that is important. The problem is that when people hear it, this is telling a story about other people not caring. It's generally kind of normalizing the idea that no one wants to hear about climate change and nobody cares, which we know is not accurate. People do care about climate change, and people do want to engage in the issue, and they do want to see change around it. So we're trying to kind of flip the switch and say, let's normalize action instead of getting stuck into a story where nobody cares and nobody's doing anything. So instead of this story, which is all about kind of the crisis, no one's doing anything anyone is doing is insubstantial, and not enough of us are playing our part, we need to flip it, and we need to say most of us in the UK or wherever we are want to play our part in reviving our planet, and we're already starting to make changes in our lives. Our leaders can and must act to secure a healthy future for all of us. So it's a story that involves all of us, and it's a story that is actually putting kind of pressure on the people who have the option to make the transformative change at a societal level, to show that there's that powerful mandate for that. And obviously these aren't kind of script recommendations. These are just illustrations of how you might apply this principle in practice. We worked with the Royal Foundation and Prince William on the launch of the Earthshot Prize in order to bake some of these principles into what they were doing with that. And this is what Kate Blanchett said at the launch of the Earthshot Prize. She said, there's no greater challenge facing us as a species than climate change, but we human beings are capable of so very much. And of course, there are solutions. They're already out there. We just need to harness them. So it's not playing down the problem. It's not saying there's no problem. It's not kind of sugarcoating it, but it's balancing, crucially, it's balancing the scale of the problem with our ability to do something about it. So the second recommendation is all about health, and obviously health is extremely topical at the moment, and it's also a really important way of being able to overcome the tendency that people have to dismiss environmental issues as something that's kind of over there and maybe not super relevant to my life. And research shows that when we connect the planet's health with our own health, and we sort of talk about the planet as having health, and we focus on the idea that the planet can be harmed but can also be healed, and we connect that directly with our own health, and we see some really powerful effects in people actually coming to understand just how much this matters, and also to feel a sense of possibility around making change. So again, instead of a pure crisis story and a story that really focuses on kind of destruction and uninhabitable planet, we can talk about how our health depends on us having a healthy planet, but right now our actions are hurting the planet. We can and must heal our world. And we know that that's really powerful in presenting a kind of truth that people can't sort of run away from, but also can feel more powerful and have more of a sense of agency around. And just as an example of this, the language of kind of repairing and reviving. So these health ideas, these health words were really baked into the way that we framed up this the Earthshot Prize. And my third principle for today is all about emphasizing our shared responsibility to younger generations and future generations. I think this has been a really powerful shift we've seen in the debate around climate change in recent years, particularly with Greta Thunberg and with other young people advocating on the issue. We've seen a sense of this issue moving away from being about science to being about human beings, and tapping into this sense of this duty we have to protect our planet for younger people and for future generations, which is really, really hard to kind of argue with or to not to see the importance of. So again, instead of telling a story which is all about crisis and all about science, we can tell a story about how actually we all really want to pass on a healthy planet to our children and grandchildren, and that we can do things to repair our planet so it's fit for the future. And an example of this, Shakira talking about feeling a sense of duty as a citizen and as a mother of 2 young children to speak out and to be active on the issue of climate change. And Prince William talking about his sense of purpose that he felt to protect the planet after becoming a dad. And if we kind of compare this to where standard approaches on kind of engaging the public in the issue of climate change might have kind of taken these people who want to do something, you know, it could have had a tendency to feel more like a science lesson or something that's more preachy, but instead it's something that is very, very humanizing and very connecting. And for most people, it speaks to a truth that is deeply connected to their own belief systems and values. So we see this as a really helpful way of kind of shifting our cultural sort of societal response, is to reframe the issue away from being it's about something over there, it's about science, it's about this big scary thing, to actually know this is about something that is core to us as humans. And that's it for my 3 of the 6 principles, and we will circulate the rest of the tips.
Lovely, thank you very much, Nikki. Very, very interesting. And having put those principles in practice, it's been really interesting to see the difference in different audiences when using them. Really fascinating stuff. Before we heard from the theory and a couple of really interesting presentations. Before we turn to our writers to look into the practicalities about how do we do this, in our jobs, I want to turn to Trisha to see if there's any couple of questions for Laura and Nikki.
Couple of very specific questions for Nikki and Laura, if that's okay, and then I know you're all desperate to hear from the others. Laura, one question's come in from Prem. Thank you very much, Prem. Just asking, could you please give an example of acknowledge the natural words exist, and particularly what would be an opposite example of that? So I don't know whether you can just expand on that very briefly, and then I've got a very quick question for Nikki, and then we'll hear from the rest.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the reason that we came up with that is to not just use it's to reference it. So reference the natural world somehow, and up to you how you do that. Whether that's a mention of how awesome nature is or how useful it is to us or something like that. I'm trying to think of an opposite example, but I guess it's not just using nature as the backdrop that's like a passive backdrop, but it's something that's active, I would say.
Okay, I hope that helps. And Nikki, I wonder whether I can pose this question to you. It's actually been quite a specific question from Sarah. Thank you, Sarah, who's from the National Federation of the Blind, but I'm going to take a liberty and just expand it out about how we ensure that this is a just transition, that our actions to support the climate aren't inadvertently disadvantaging different groups, whether that be disabled groups or low-income backgrounds. I don't know if you could just briefly comment on that. Obviously, there's only so much scope that we have as writers, but I just wonder whether that's something that you've touched on in your work.
Yeah, so I think that this is about being able to tell a story that allows for interconnection of different issues. So we touched on kind of interconnection of kind of, you know, the health of the natural world with the health of humans. And we talked about it just then in terms of, you know, acknowledging, not just acknowledging that the natural world exists, but actually showing that it's deeply and inextricably interconnected with our own world. And I think that this is the same principle applies when it comes to more specific issues around social justice and being able to talk about how the climate crisis actually is interwoven with issues around social justice. But I think doing so in such a way that doesn't overwhelm people, I think is really, really key. It's not like a long list of all the problems that we face and that we have to not just tackle this thing and this thing, but actually being able to speak about how the solutions and advocate for solutions that are beneficial for everyone and beneficial for the planet's health. I'm saying all of this, acknowledging it's very, very difficult to do, but I think actually being able to talk about the future that we want and the future that we're striving for is a way to bring that to life and to avoid the trap of kind of just listing all the problems which you can get stuck into. So I think creatively there's a challenge, and I think part of the solution is about the vision and is about the kind of what good looks like and how we want things to be, as well as all the problems that we currently face.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Nikki and Laura. Obviously, stay around because there'll be the conversation will continue and there'll be more questions, which I'm sure you'll be able to chip in. But I want to turn now to Olivia and Javid to get the perspective from the writers about how do we make all this stuff happen in real life, in a real script. So first of all, Olivia, should we start with you, please? If you can just introduce yourself, a bit of your background, and how have you engaged with this topic so far, and what's been your experience?
Sure. Hi, I'm Olivia Hetreed. I'm a screenwriter. I used to be the president of the Writers Guild, and I've been sort of talking to and working with Albert over the last several years about this conversation and trying to kind of bring it into the mainstream of writers' attention, I think. And I've also been thinking about obviously my own practice and how I involve, you know, the stories that I'm telling and what I can do to change the way I think and work and so on. I think that what comes out of what Nikki and Laura have both said so brilliantly is that the conversation has moved on very usefully, I think, from is there a climate change to what do we do? But it remains tremendously controversial, and frankly, controversial is a very good thing in drama. So I think this is, you know, there's an enormous amount of story that can be told around this issue, as well as being embedded good practice.
Absolutely, and I think we'll continue to uncover that. I think there's been a shift, you know, from broadcasters to the producers to the whole creative community to really understand, you know, the breadth of the potential stories in there. And it's not just about sort of hammering people on the head with the facts or they, you know, what they should be doing or what they should be feeling, but more about, you know, representing some of the issues, you know, being authentic in terms of, you know, the challenges people are facing, and then, you know, trying to explore the nitty-gritty of that. So I think there's definitely some progression there. Javid, turning to you now, can you tell us a bit more about you and your background and how you've engaged with this so far?
Yeah, sure. I'm Javid. I'm also a screenwriter, and I've written primarily a lot of children's stuff. I've done everything from preschool, but all the way up to adult drama as well, and soaps as well. So this has been really interesting actually for me as well, because, you know, as writers, we're constantly kind of getting information, but we're also trying to figure out what the best way to do it. And is there, you know, there's no right or wrong way, but so we're all trying to navigate it together. But I must say that, you know, from all the writers' rooms that I've been in, actually, these aren't prominent conversations that have been happening. And so there's still, you know, I think events like this, and I think having these discussions is the most important way forward, because like I said, I've not been having these discussions, or people haven't, you know, broadcasters or producers haven't been having them with me in their writers' room. So I think, you know, I'm sure there's lots of people, producers as well as writers on here. So I think it's good to get talking.
Yeah, I think the conversation is definitely sort of picking up pace now, and all broadcasters, I think, now in the UK have made explicit commitments around what they're trying to do editorially in terms of bringing this conversation to their screens. So I think that's only going to go forward. I think it's interesting for us to think about what's the practicality of how you bring that conversation. Maybe Olivia, turning back to you, have you had examples of interesting creative conversations happening around this, or what do you think are the ways to bring the topic up as you sort of work on the project?
Absolutely. I think it's, it's essential that it's always has a personal reason, that when you're trying to tell a story, you don't think about the cause and you don't think about, the kind of, or the great, political story I want to tell. You think about how does this affect the individuals in the story, and how does it motivate them, and what, as I say, conflict is the meat and drink of drama. So what conflict does this create within families, between generations, between different groups of people who have different expectations? We touched briefly in those examples on the whole idea, the question of the kind of colonialization of this problem, where we have a lot of rich white people telling much poorer people that they shouldn't do something because we've already done it and messed things up for you. So, there are lots of kind of controversial aspects which need to come into individual stories. So, for instance, at the moment, I'm doing a story which is a mountain climbing adventure story. And on the face of it, it's a straightforward story about, people climbing a mountain and getting into trouble. But you almost immediately realize that the places where we're feeling this situation most sharply are at the extremes of the world. So the highest, the coldest, the warmest, the lowest, the hottest places are where climate change is already happening and already having a dramatic effect on people's lives. So even though I'm, telling a story which is an adventure story, that whole aspect of it, how the mountain has changed in the 20 years since the climber was last there, how that's changed the lives of the people, how the change in the lives of the people has changed their attitude to the people who are coming there to climb. All of those things are just inherent to a story, which I think even a few years ago, I probably wouldn't have kind of noticed them in the same way. And I hope it's still going to be an exciting adventure story, but it's an exciting adventure story in which there's a level underneath it in which all these things are playing out and present in the story.
It's very interesting, and it becomes almost like the backdrop. And as our world is changing, maybe our backdrop needs to reflect all these things, as well as the, reflecting some, maybe I like the point that Nikki made around repetition and the fact that, we may hear something on a factual program or on the news, but then to be able to illustrate it with, more of a drama kind of envelope, or kind of a different type of storytelling, kind of maybe reinforces it in our mind. And we don't need to hammer the point around, the melting ice caps in the drama, but, they kind of like provides illustration from something else that we heard. So there's something around all different sort of types of output kind of work with each other.
And the backdrop influences the way people behave, and it's the way people behave that always engages us as tellers of story.
Very interesting. And as we look at the world will continue to change. So it's interesting. Are we kind of trying to preserve a kind of like pristine and natural environment that's doesn't exist anymore just because that's part of what we think the story should be, or do we walk along with this? That is very interesting. Maybe Jerry, coming back to you, in terms, do you have any thoughts around the different opportunities for different types of genres and different types of of scripted productions? How would you maybe sort of try to think about it, try to approach it for different types of projects or different types of audiences that you may have in mind?
Yeah, I think it really depends, obviously, on the project. And I also, what really got me thinking was, I think as new writers creating new content, you have more, when you know about it and it's in the back of your head and you're thinking about the planet test, for example, as Laura mentioned, which I think we should all be thinking about now. You have more of that freedom and liberty to write. I'm thinking also in terms of if you're going into existing long-running shows as a writer, that, how can we have those discussions with characters that are already existing? that, you know, audiences already love so much, and they will, you know, sniff it out if you're just throwing things in there just, you know, because you want to kind of take the one of the planet tests, for example. So I think, again, it depends on, you know, the project you're going into. Did I answer that question?
Yeah, no, it's
I'm
interesting.
not 100% sure. I think I'm wrong.
But also, if you're working for like a children program, or if you're working for, you know, more kind of a, you know, different types of adult audiences, you may sort of approach it, you know, with different sort of mindset from the outset. Maybe.
Well, for sure. And I think because I've written a lot of children's stuff and preschool stuff, there's a lot of education based there. So, you know, not only are the kids watching it, but their parents are watching it with them as well. So I'm already thinking about, for example, shows like JoJo and Gran Gran, which have that educational one-off episode, which includes storytelling plus real children speaking to the camera about their experiences or what they think about the topic that week. So, you know, I think you can implement it in a lot more, I feel, in children's television, because, you know, you could do a whole episode on solar panels, or you could do, you know, whatever it may be. So I think the approach, though, is this. I would approach it the same way if I was doing a preschool, a children's, or an adult drama. At the end of the day, it's just about figuring out and navigating what's the best way to tell those stories without, you know, like you said, preaching was the word that I've heard, being too preachy.
Okay. It's about making great content that, you know, brings the audience to it, as opposed to, you know, pushing that. Trisha, shall we turn to you?
Yeah, so I just wanted to jump in off the back of what you said there, David, because a few questions have come along this sort of topic, and it is specifically about preaching. So Emma, thank you for your question. She says, if I write a character now that's vegetarian, sustainability conscious, never uses plastic, doesn't drive, only buys recycled and repurposed, they come over as kind of holier than thou and a little bit of a nuisance. So how do we change that? And Jennifer also sort of added, you know, how do we make sure that viewers take these issues seriously if they're being presented in fiction? And so I thought that there's sort of nuance together there, this idea of authenticity and not preaching, along with how does it actually get taken seriously. And I don't know whether one of you perhaps would have a go at answering that question.
I think what Javid said about not kind of thrusting these things onto a character. So, you know, you as an audience, we can all go, oh, suddenly they've taken a turn for the green and we don't really believe it, you know. But I think it's this question of it being a conversation, really, and a thing that, you know, that a younger character might be challenging an older character with, and that if the conversation is there, present, not necessarily literally a conversation, but in what they're doing, you know, if you're going to protest, if you're going on school strike, or, you know, there are all sorts of things that characters can be doing which other characters will react to. And once you think about having those things within the storyline, then they become part of the conversation of all the different characters. And if, you know, if you go, well, I noticed there's I think a producer from EastEnders on that, you know, the soaps have always had a brilliant way of engaging with social issues, and how do you bring this into that environment, and what storylines are you telling, and which characters are most appropriate to tell it, is absolutely the lifeblood of that kind of drama. I don't think you need to be preaching, but I think you can also use the fact that there are those really hopeful messages on the one hand, but there are people who feel extremely despairing and nihilistic, and there are scientists who are saying it's already too late, and, you know, there's no point just going, oh, everything's going to be wonderful and it's all going to turn out happily ever after. You know, you want to deal with the difficulty of it. I think this last year has made us all feel like we're pretty clear about the difficulty of massive change to our lives. It's, you know, this incredible disruption and change. And what you see is, on the one hand, the extraordinary adaptability of human beings, that we kind of go, okay, this is what we're doing now. We've changed our lives. We're living on Zoom. We're doing, but on the other hand, the devastating impact that change makes, and that is to quite a large extent sort of invisible. You could, if you're living in this little bubble that we're all living in here, you may not be seeing what's going on for other people for whose livelihoods have been completely decimated by what's happening.
It's a really good point. And before going into Nikki, because that's a really important, interesting point around the framing, reflection. As long as we keep talking about, having the characters that are, vegan, eco-friendly, all this kind of stuff, I think we're still framing it as an individual behavior, as if, individual behaviors are the way to fix this problem. I think that's interesting is that we're starting to realize that, we're going to need much more collective action, and we need to tackle much more complex problems as well. So, we can reflect the world of, people who may be losing their jobs because they're dependent on a, high carbon industry, for example. What's the experience of people losing their jobs and trying to find another livelihood that in a green industry, for example? So just as an example, but I think the idea of just framing it as individual action, I think we're kind of moving ahead of that conversation now and trying to realize what is collective action look like? How do we come together to transform this? And what's the society transformation that we need? And what are all the impacts that people will be feeling in their lives? And how can we reflect that in a more authentic manner? I think there's a lot of potential little juice there in a way that's authentic and relevant and definitely not preachy. Nikki, you wanted to add to that?
I want to echo that, because I think that there's a real need to widen the lens when it comes to what climate change action is about and what kind of adapting and changing in response to the issue is all about. I think that there's a lot of content that really speaks to the kind of individual zealot or individual anxious person, and I think that is important, and those are important stories, but they can also run the risk of continuing to other the issue and to make it something that I watched a great show recently, but it had the main character's dad was a kind of wacky eco-maniac, and he was really easy to laugh at and really easy to kind of feel a bit predictable around, but it doesn't do anything for actually kind of involving you in the issue. It just makes it into that crazy person's issue. And I think that we've got to widen the lens, and we've got to show that this is a systemic issue. It's something that affects all of us. It's going to require us all to change. And as you say, this is about, and I know this is hard to do when you're a script writer and you mainly deal in characters, but it's about systems and industries and leadership. And how can you tell those kinds of stories, and how can you tell them in ways that aren't as boring as I just made that sound? I think that's the really rich creative challenge that we face here.
Cool. Excellent.
I've just jumped in like the meerkat that I am. I always think I'm like the meerkat of these these webinars, just to use a natural world example. I just wanted to pose this question to you, which just really leads off from what you were just talking about, Nikki, about the different variety of content to tell these stories. So Matthew, thank you very much for your question. I can only guess the type of content that you are responsible for writing. He says, we're trying to move away now from the scare tactic approach of dystopias and displaying the possibility of a better future through utopia. Fantastic. Inspiring rather than fear. But is there still a place for dystopian stories? I think this is a plea from the heart, probably. I don't know whether anyone thinks that there still is a relevance for some Armageddon now and again.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always a place for dystopian, but I've realized with everything that's happened in the world, especially the past year and a half, we've been living almost in our own sort of dystopian world. So maybe not for a little while yet. I think we.
Yeah, I think also that the whole dystopia. I mean, I'm sorry, I've forgotten who showed that little line of sort of end of the world scenario films. That we know how that story goes, and it doesn't really, not sure it really addresses what we're trying to discuss here, which is where we go from here rather than where we are now, or it's because the end of the world version of the story doesn't really progress the discussion about how we behave differently and change things, does it?
So that leads to lovely, beautifully into the next question that I would love to throw out here. And Laura, maybe it's one that you can expand on just in terms of thinking about the resources that we have. But Lena, thank you. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. She said thank you very much to everybody, and that one of her favourite principles from you, Nikki, was this idea of we need to change the things that make the most difference. So she wants to know, how do writers in this industry gain better scientific and political literacy to be able to do this job more effectively? It's out of most people's area of expertise, is her point.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. So I would point you to the planet placement resource, so the trends. I think they have, there's loads of, basically what we did was collate a load of lots of data and kind of scientific reports. So we've basically done a lot of that hard work and synthesized them into kind of really clear themes. So I would definitely say start there. And then Trisha, I would also say that Albert training is a great way to get the, you know, in terms of some literacy, in terms of, if, you know, getting to a level set knowledge of understanding of climate issues. I say that's a good place to start as well. And
as you will all know, you know, training is available online for free. Go to the Albert website, albert.org. I'm sure the team will thank you, Kishan, where you can get access to, you know, fantastic training for production communities as well as editorial. So some fantastic resources there. I got more question for Olivia and Javid, and I'm interested in what are the opportunities at different stages of the writing process, and, you know, how would you approach it maybe when you're developing an idea, or when you're kind of, you know, finalizing, putting the, you know, the final touches on the concept? Are there different ways to approach it at different stages, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think that first of all, that, you know, using those kind of quite straightforward tools of, is this going to pass a little test, you know, so that that it's embedded in the development of the story and the characters, rather than having to kind of stick something on top that addresses it, is really useful. I think, I mean, I've just been talking to some people about virtual production, so thinking, not being limited in the scope of your imagination, because there are ways of making films now where you wouldn't have to go, you know, to 7 different countries to shoot your epic story, because you can actually shoot them all on the Pinewood stages. So understanding also that there are different technologies we can use now, so that the way that we tell stories, not only the story that we tell, but the way that we tell the story, is also more ecologically friendly and environmentally conscious. And I think also that understanding that, you know, it always has to be about a good story, so that however heartfelt you feel about the message, it mustn't be, the virtuous thing mustn't top the storytelling thing, because if you do that, then you'll fail on both counts, because people just won't watch it, won't be interested in it. So you have to engage, and then you can have space to tell your story.
Yeah, I was going to say 100%. I think the creative process everyone's so different, but there's so many, it's very emotional. As, like, you know, as writers, we're writing and we're putting our heart out into the characters. So I think having these things in the back of your mind when you write is important. I think if it doesn't work, if it doesn't fit, you know, your story or your storyline, like, that's okay as well. And maybe going to what you were saying, maybe towards the end, is that could be a time of reflection. Maybe towards the end, you look back at your script and you say, could I have maybe, you know, like, in the smallest possible example I'm using here, but did they need a car in that scene? Could they have cycled, for example? Or, you know, did I put something in there that wasn't actually that relevant to the story? But because I was trying to, you know, do the planet test I put it in and it didn't work. So it's, you know, I think having that reflection on your own work at the end is always useful, but I also think not, you know, kind of beating yourself up over it. If you're emotional, you're, you know, we're, like I said, we're very emotional about our characters. We, you know them so well, and they might not be vegan, you know. In fact, they might love eating meat, but, you know, maybe they love eating meat, but further down the line, you could say, oh, maybe they'll eat less meat. Eventually, they're making the conscious effort as well as me. So it's about working with your characters, your story, and reflecting at the end.
Interesting. And I think, you know, as I think everybody mentioned, the conversation has been really evolving over the last few years. And I think the more we talk about it, you know, in a creative manner, I think the further we will go in terms of, you know, engaging with this. You know, some interesting industry news, just to make sure everybody's on the same, you know, is aware of it. Albert has launched a new version of the certification standard for, you know, the Albert Carbon Action Plan, and that has, you know, included in it now some editorial questions. So there will be questions now that all the productions that are going through Albert certification or Carbon Action Plan have to go, you know, that how have you sort of trying to normalize sustainable behavior or sustainable sceneries, or how have you thought about not embedding, you know, unsustainable behaviors, for example. So that would be part more and more into the part of the creative conversation. And thank you, Kishan, for showing the link here. Likewise, you know, the BBC has changed the commissioning specification recently, so that for every single genre that gets commissioned, every new commission, there has to be a conversation between the commissioning editor and the exec producer around what are the opportunities to bring sustainability on the editorial of the program. Likewise, Sky has some, you know, planet test of their own for for every Sky original. So I feel like all the broadcasters are becoming more and more interested and asking more and more creative ideas about how to engage with this. So I'm really interested to see how that conversation continues to evolve, and how the creative community can come up with new and different types of ideas. I had a question as well, just to come back to the previous point we were making around, you know, dystopia versus utopia, and whether you know, there's something in the middle or something about a bit more complex about how we engage with this. Because there's some really interesting quote I heard. I can't remember where it was. I think it was Christian Figueres, possibly one of the, you know, the key architect of the climate conversation and action. And she was basically telling us that the 2020s are going to be both, you know, much better in terms of all, you know, the impacts we're making and the kind of progress we're making on climate, but also much worse in terms of the physical impact we're already committed to, and the kind of, you know, the changes to our natural world around us that's just going to get worse as we go towards, you know, that 1.5 degree number. And it's not necessarily about, you know, just feeling elated by the progress or, you know, desperate about, you know, the negative impact, but how do we have a bit more complexity in our thinking? How do we appreciate that, you know, things may be getting worse, but there's still a lot that we can do in order to have, you know, a more positive future. And it feels like a more complex narrative that's not as simple as, if I just do this, you know, the problem will go away. How is there an opportunity within scripted to go into that complexity a bit more, to go into, you know, more challenging messages around, yes, we may feel, you know, excited about you, but also scared about it. And how do we play with that in a way that feels more reflecting maybe the reality of the situation that we're experiencing out there? I wonder if open to the whole panel.
I think you're right in that presents both. It's actually quite a good opportunity to tell a story that isn't binary in terms of this or that, but there's a complexity to it, and that's full of tension, right? Like there's so much tension and conflict there. So I think in terms of drama, surely that would allow, I mean, I would leave that up to the experts to say how you would translate that into compelling drama. But I think, you know, intuitively that feels like really ripe ground for telling a story that isn't, you know, black or white, this or that, but actually there's complex and there's tension between progress on one hand and, you know, like you said, some of the feeling the impacts on the other as well.
Yeah, I think I'm sure you're probably all aware of a film called Planet of the Humans, which is the Michael Moore exec-produced film, saying that a great deal of green enterprise is thoroughly flawed. And watching that, I thought, oh, there's a fantastic film called Thank You for Smoking, which was about the PR to keep people smoking, and it was just a brilliant, black comedy about that story that told you exactly the complexity of the issues and why there are vested interests who want you to keep behaving in certain ways, and made it extremely funny as well. And I thought, this is, this story that they're telling here, where they go, oh, look, here are people being tremendously virtuous and saying how good they are and how green they are, and I'm going around the back and saying, oh no, they're not, because they've still got a massive diesel generator, and so on. That this story is it doesn't have to be desperately serious. It can also be funny and deeply revealing, because we're human beings and we constantly mess up and trip over ourselves and try and do the right thing and end up doing the wrong thing. And all of those things are the perfect stuff of drama.
I think that the Michael Moore film may have some factual issues with it, just for me. But that's another aspect, the importance of being factual, appropriate. But you make a good point in terms of the complexity of it. I have one more question, but Tricia, also, if if there's any kind of final ones from you.
There are loads of questions, and I'm sorry I haven't been able to get to all of them. It's another question that's come up about inclusion, actually. So somebody has raised, thank you, Prem, the links between colonialism and the current climate situation. And so therefore, should we be finding ways to address racism and colonialism from within the environmental conservation movement itself, so that the sort of to reach groups outside the bubble is the phrase that they've used. And there's one other, let me find it, which is related to that, which is around the approach that we take to sustainability and normalising it. Should we actually follow the same approach and attention and carefulness we have made in this industry towards racism and genre issues? I think they mean gender issues, for example, today. Should that be the way that we start to deal with this?
I can maybe talk to, is it Prem's point around
intersectionality and
intersectionality? Yeah, a really, 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 really important point. And I think that the particularly in 2020 we saw how interlinked different challenges are. I think the environmental movement has been asking itself some very big questions, and it's got a really long history, which we don't obviously have time to go into. But I think what's really interesting is the Sierra Club. So they're an NGO based in the US, set up late 1800s, early 1900s, founded by someone called John Muir, who's was very lauded in the environmental movement. He was really what you would call a transcendentalist, very connected to nature, wanted to preserve nature. And the conservation movement has been born from, people like John Muir, who were white males who were in privileged positions, both, economically and socially, and had really difficult, bad relationships with indigenous populations in America. So that's the birthplace often of the conservation movement as it stands today. So I think it's really important that we understand those histories, understand where it's born from. But then there's also, I think, a really great opportunity here, because environmentalism is often seen as this white pursuit or white middle class pursuit, and it shouldn't be. And I think we're not telling the other stories. So Dr. Robert Bullard, who's known as the godfather of the environmental justice movement, the environment isn't, vast nature over there. The environment's here. It's I'm living in northeast London, and the environment's right here. And there's a lot of activists who've been working for, I would say, since the 80s and 90s, so for a long time, on these issues of how environmental injustice and discrimination affects, you know, normal working people, often people of color who are living in, you know, like in America, issues around water and clean water. So that's just to say that I think, yes, it is an issue and we need to deal with that in terms of the environmental movement. I think some really important conversations are starting to be had, particularly at those big NGO levels. But also we need to tell those other stories of environmental activists who have been working so tirelessly and doing brilliant work. We just don't hear those stories. So there's another opportunity, I think.
I think it's very much like, you know, the direction of travel, you know, moving away from just talking about climate or just talking about individual action, and more around how do we transition into a sustainable society, and how do we make that inclusive, and how do we bring everyone to the party? How do we give everyone a voice in that transition? And, you know, that may be challenging, they may be full of emotion, they may be full of drama, full of conflicts, but that's the story that's, you know, I think is going to really help us, you know, forward in that conversation. I'm mindful of time, so, you know, just maybe a final thought from our panelist. Any sort of key learning that we had, or any sort of, you know, key ideas that we can take with us, you know, moving forward? Maybe Javid, Olivia, sort of any thoughts from today?
I think the point that you made about seeing this as a general issue that has to underline the whole story rather than it being about individuals is a really useful thing. I think I'm going to go away and think about that and how I can put that in the stories that I'm telling, rather than that idea of, you know, there's the one green activist, or like, you know, there are lots of being great films about campaigners and things, but then it's one person kind of battling the system. So how do we tell stories that move the system?
Excellent.
Yeah, this whole event has been very, you know, eye-opening. I think everyone has learned so much, especially me. And I think definitely when we go ahead and write, I think it's definitely going to be, you know, in the back of our minds thinking as we create. And that's the most important thing, because, you know, the stories, that's what will change culture, that's what will change society, that's what will change people's viewpoints. So we can do it, really. We just got to go ahead and write.
Excellent, thank you. Nikki, Laura, thank you very much for your inputs. Any kind of, you know, thoughts from you guys in terms of the you know, how you can continue to support this sector?
Yeah, just from us to say, I can't really top what Olivia and Javid just said, which is, you know, we have a creative challenge and we're motivated to tackle it. But my organisation is there to work with writers and creatives who are grappling with these exact challenges, and we love to hear from people who are in the process of thinking about how you take these really big challenges and opportunities and bake them into actual sort of content. So I'd love to hear from you. And also just to kind of say, you know, we need creative voices and storytellers. We won't get ourselves out of this situation if we don't change the stories about it. So I think that the task that you all have is as important as the task that the scientists have and the politicians have. You're as much as part of this as anyone. And I'm going to stop talking now because my kids are about to come in and bomb the Zoom.
Okay, Nikki. Laura, any final thoughts from yourself?
Yeah, it's so wonderful to be connected to this community, and I think you know, like Nikki said, you've got the creative community, the creators of culture have got a real task on your hands, but I don't doubt that you won't be able to rise to that challenge. And I think that really what I'm taking away from this event is like the importance of human storytelling. It's just at the center of all of this. So whilst I think that, you know, climate change and environmental issues may seem, can seem quite technical or, you know, a bit divorced from us maybe, but just the ability to tell that human story, I think just really hang on to that. And, you know, as Javid said, these, it's not just a case of, I think the planet test is interesting because it's an interesting, you know, just pulse check, but don't sacrifice a story just for putting something in for the sake of it. So yeah, and in terms of how we really believe in the ability for creatives to really help accelerate this movement. So I think, you know, Futera and obviously through Planet Placement, we'd love to keep supporting there. So it's just great to get the feedback and just to hear what your challenges are as well around creating the content.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone. Trisha?
Can I just pop up before you do the closing wrap, Jeremy, just to say huge thanks to everybody who put questions in the Q&A. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them. I think some of them were answered in a roundabout way, if not directly, though, that were raised. And also to let you all know, the panelists, that we had over 200 people at this event today, and the love and pouring out of gratitude and inspiration has been just extreme. So I just wanted to let you all know that the sorts of comments that we're getting here are really, really positive. So thank you all very much from me and from Albert as well.
Excellent. So just a few final thoughts. Training available for Albert, you know, wearealbert.org. Go to social media and get all the good stuff. You know, that's available, you know, on the, as you can see, all there. Thank you to our partners, Sergeant Disc, Green Tomato Cows, Good Energy, Kama, Location One. All, you know, the events wouldn't happen without you. So thank you very, very much. And my final thought, you know, as we discussed, you know, throughout the evening, climate change is a culture conversation nowadays. It's how do we, as a society, move forward? And one of the key assets that we have in order to help us forward is our talent. How can we harness our talent in order to move towards a sustainable society? We're going to need the engineers, the lawyers, the politicians, the people who make things, and the people who create stories and help us make sense of this incredible period of history that we are in right now. So we need everybody's talent to be harnessed towards helping us towards that amazing sustainable society that we can create. So thank you very much to everyone for attending, and all the best for your endeavors.